The boy was 7 years old, standing alone beside a gas pump at a Flying J off Interstate 40 in Amarillo, Texas, holding a photograph with both hands like it was made of something that could break. He wasn't crying. That was the first thing that caught Tommy Briggs's attention. A child that age, alone at a busy truck stop on a Saturday afternoon in July, should have been crying. Instead, the boy stood very still, watching the traffic on the service road with the quiet patience of someone who had learned that making noise didn't bring the kind of help he needed. Tommy had pulled his Heritage Softale up to the far pump at 2:30, grateful for the shade thrown by the station canopy after 90 miles of open Texas highway. He was 53 years old, road captain for the High Plains Brotherhood MC out of Lubbock, a broad-shouldered man with a gray beard cut close and hands that had spent 3 decades between engine work and honest labor. His vest carried the patches of 21 years in the club, a combat veteran pin from 2 tours in the Gulf, and a small ribbon he wore for his younger brother who'd never made it home from Fallujah. Tommy had been a school resource officer for 11 years after leaving the Army, which meant he had spent more than a decade learning to read the body language of children, learning to tell the difference between a kid who was fine and a kid who had decided that being fine was the only safe performance available to them. He knew which one he was looking at now. The boy was maybe 4 feet tall, wearing a red-striped t-shirt that was clean but slightly too large, cargo shorts and sneakers with the Velcro tabs hanging loose. His hair was dark brown and cut short, with a cowlick at the crown that no one had smoothed down that morning. He held the photograph at his midsection with both hands, looking up at Tommy's vest the way children look at something that matches a picture they carry in their memory. Tommy finished setting the pump nozzle and walked toward him slowly, not cutting across the distance in a way that might startle, but angling his path so the boy could see him coming from a full 30 feet out. The boy didn't run. He watched Tommy approach with those steady, measuring eyes. When Tommy was close enough to speak without raising his voice, he stopped and crouched down to the boy's level, putting 14 inches of height between them instead of 1.5 feet. He asked the boy gently if he was okay. The boy looked at Tommy's vest for another long moment, studying the patches with the focused attention of someone cross-referencing information. Then he looked up at Tommy's face and asked the question in a voice that was quiet and completely serious. He asked if Tommy was his dad. Tommy felt something shift in his chest, the particular stillness that came just before something important. He told the boy as gently as he knew how that he wasn't, but that he was a friend and that he'd like to help if the boy needed it. The boy looked down at the photograph in his hands and held it out. Tommy took it carefully. It was a 4x6 print, handled so many times at the edges that the paper had gone soft, almost velvet. The image showed a man in a leather motorcycle vest, standing beside a Heritage Softale that was almost identical to Tommy's own bike. The man was laughing at something off-camera, mid-40s, dark hair going silver at the temples, with the same cowlick the boy had inherited. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in pen, in the careful handwriting of someone who wanted to be understood, "If you ever get lost, look for a biker. Your dad was one of the good ones." Tommy read those words twice. Then he looked at the boy. He asked him his name. The boy said his name was Danny Carver. And then he said his dad's name was Robert Carver, and that people called him Rook, and that his mom said Rook had ridden with a club in Texas a long time ago. Tommy knew that name. He had not heard it in 4 years, but he knew it the way you knew the names of men you'd ridden beside, long enough that their road name became shorthand for a whole catalog of moments. Rook Carver had prospected into the High Plains Brotherhood out of their Abilene chapter 11 years ago, a quiet, steady man who turned wrenches for a living and showed up when brothers needed help without being asked. He'd transferred to a chapter in New Mexico after remarrying, and Tommy had lost track of him the way distance made it easy to lose track of people when life didn't slow down enough to keep the connections tight. He'd heard through a mutual brother sometime in the past few years that Rook had been sick. He hadn't heard anything after that. He looked at Danny and asked him carefully where his mom was. Danny pointed toward the main building of the travel center, a Flying J with a Denny's attached and a trucker's lounge along the far wall. He said she was inside and that she'd told him to wait by the bike because she'd be 2 minutes, and that was a long time ago. He said he'd been watching the motorcycles in the lot because his mom had said his dad used to ride, and he wanted to see if any of the riders looked like the picture. Tommy stood up and kept the photograph carefully in his hand. He told Danny to stay right beside him, that they were going to go find his mom together, and that he wasn't going to leave him out here alone. Danny fell into step beside him, with the immediate trust of a child who had been waiting for an adult to take charge and meant it. Tommy's mind was already moving through the sequence. The boy had been outside alone at a truck stop on a major interstate for longer than 2 minutes. That needed to be addressed, not with judgment, but with the kind of calm efficiency that kept situations from becoming worse than they needed to be. He scanned the lot as they crossed it, noting the vehicles, the people, the geometry of the space. Inside, the Flying J was loud with the Saturday midday rush, truckers and families and road crews filling the restaurant and the convenience aisles. Tommy stopped at the customer service counter and spoke to the attendant, identifying himself as a former law enforcement officer and asking her to page a woman who might be looking for a child. The announcement went out over the intercom 30 seconds later. Within 90 seconds, a woman came running from the direction of the women's restroom at the far end of the building. She was in her mid-30s, dark-haired, wearing a blue hospital lanyard around her neck that still had her work badge clipped to it. Her face was the specific white of a person who has just understood what fear actually feels like. She dropped to her knees in front of Danny and pulled him in against her with both arms, and Tommy watched the boy's face go from steady and careful to 7 years old in the span of half a second. Her name was Angela Carver. When she stood back up and looked at Tommy with eyes that were still bright with the adrenaline of the past 90 seconds, she noticed the vest. She noticed the High Plains Brotherhood patches, and her expression shifted into something quieter and more complicated. She asked him which chapter. He told her Lubbock, but that he'd ridden with the Abilene chapter often enough to know most of their members. He held out the photograph. He told her he thought he might have known her husband. Angela Carver took the photograph from Tommy's hand and held it for a moment the way someone holds something they've learned to be careful with. She said that Robert had passed 14 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in February, gone by April. She said it so directly that Tommy understood she had practiced the words until they stopped destroying her every time she said them out loud, which was its own kind of grief to witness. She said the hardest part, after everything, was that Danny had been too young to understand what the club had meant to his father, and that she hadn't known how to explain it in a way that made sense to a 6-year-old who just wanted his dad to come home. So she had given him the photograph and told him what was written on the back, because Robert had written those words himself during his last week in the hospital, when he was still clear enough to think about the things he wanted Danny to carry forward. Tommy stood there in the middle of a Flying J travel center off Interstate 40 in Amarillo, Texas, with the afternoon light coming through the plate glass windows and the sound of a Denny's lunch rush behind them. And he felt the particular weight of a moment that asks something of you. He told Angela he was sorry for her loss. Then he told her that if she was willing, he'd like to make a phone call. The High Plains Brotherhood had a chapter in Amarillo. Tommy knew the president, a man named Gerald who went by Church, a retired firefighter who had ridden with Rook twice at regional runs and would remember him. Tommy stepped a few feet away and made the call. He explained the situation in the direct, minimal way that men who have learned to communicate under pressure learn to communicate. Rook Carver's son was at the Flying J on the west side. The boy was 7. He was carrying a photograph of his father. He needed to meet some of the people who had known his dad. Church's response was 4 words: "We'll be there soon." Tommy walked back to Angela and Danny and suggested they get something to eat while they waited. Danny ordered a grilled cheese sandwich and a chocolate milk and ate with the focused seriousness of a child who had spent a long morning being brave and had earned his lunch. Angela drank coffee and told Tommy about Robert in pieces, the way people talk about someone they loved when they finally find a listener who has a reason to care. She said he had been a mechanic, that he could diagnose an engine problem by sound alone, that he sang off-key to the radio without any self-consciousness whatsoever, that he had been a genuinely patient father in the way that some men are patient, because they've decided it matters more than anything else. She said Danny had inherited his cowlick and his stubbornness, and his habit of watching people carefully before deciding to trust them. Tommy said that sounded like Rook. Angela smiled at that, the first real smile he'd seen from her. She said that was the best thing anyone had said to her in a long time. 40 minutes after Tommy's phone call, 7 motorcycles pulled into the Flying J lot. Tommy saw them from the window and watched Danny see them too, the boy going still in that particular way he had, tracking the riders as they parked and dismounted with the alert attention of a child cataloging something important. Church came through the door first, a big man in his late 50s with a white beard and the measured calm of someone who had spent decades walking into burning buildings. Behind him came 6 more brothers from the Amarillo chapter, men ranging from their late 30s to early 60s, all of them wearing High Plains Brotherhood vests, all of them understanding from Church's phone call what this afternoon was about. Church looked at Danny for a long moment. Then he crouched down and told the boy his name, and said that he had ridden with his father at a rally in Ruidoso 7 years ago, and that Robert Carver was one of the best men he'd ever met on 2 wheels. Danny looked at him with those careful, measuring eyes. Then he held up the photograph. Church took it gently and studied it for a moment, and then passed it to the brother beside him, and it moved through all 7 men that way, each of them looking at it, each of them saying something quiet and true. One of the brothers, a retired postal worker named Dennis who went by Dex, said he remembered the day that photograph was taken. He said it was at a charity run in Abilene, and that someone had just told Rook a terrible joke, and that was what the laugh was about. He said Robert Carver had a laugh that made everyone around him feel like they were in on something good. Danny listened to every word. Angela sat beside him with her hand on his back and let it happen. Tommy watched the boy's face change across the next hour, the way landscapes change when clouds move through. The weight that had been there since Tommy first saw him by the pump, that careful stillness of a child managing something too large for his size, began to ease by degrees, not disappear. Grief in a 7-year-old doesn't disappear in an afternoon, but it shifted into something shared, something carried by more than one pair of hands. The brothers told stories, not polished stories, but the real kind, with rough edges and wrong turns and moments that didn't resolve neatly. They talked about Rook's mechanical instincts, the way he could look at a problem and immediately identify the one thing everyone else had missed. They talked about his loyalty, the kind that didn't require an audience. They talked about the time he'd stayed with a brother whose truck had broken down on a mountain pass in New Mexico for 4 hours in 30-degree weather until the tow arrived, because leaving wasn't something he was willing to do. Danny asked questions in between. Careful, specific questions, the questions of a child who has been thinking about something for a long time and finally has the right people in the room. He asked if his dad had been scared sometimes. Dex told him honestly that every person who's worth anything is scared sometimes, and that his father had the particular courage of someone who felt the fear and did the right thing anyway. Danny thought about that for a moment and then nodded, satisfied. Before they left the travel center, Church spoke privately with Angela. The High Plains Brotherhood had a family support program for the spouses and children of members who had passed. It wasn't formal, he explained, but it was real. It meant showing up. It meant making sure Danny knew his father's legacy was something living rather than something archived. It meant phone calls and visits and invitations to events where the boy could grow up understanding that his father had belonged to something that still existed. Angela said yes before he finished the sentence. In the parking lot, with the late afternoon sun throwing long shadows across the asphalt, the brothers gathered around Tommy's Heritage Softdale, and Danny stood beside it looking at the bike, and then at the photograph, and then at the bike again, making the connection visually, understanding something through his eyes that words hadn't fully delivered. Tommy asked him if he'd like to sit on it. Angela nodded. Tommy lifted the boy onto the seat, and Danny put both hands on the handlebars with the instinctive grip of someone doing something for the first time that they were born to eventually do. He sat there for a moment in the particular stillness that had been with him all afternoon, but different now. Not the stillness of waiting, the stillness of arriving. He said quietly that his dad used to have one like this. Tommy told him he knew. He told him that was why he'd stopped when he saw him standing alone, that something had told him to pay attention, and he'd learned a long time ago that when that particular feeling arrived, the right response was to listen to it. Danny handed the photograph back to Tommy and asked him to look at it one more time. Tommy did. The boy in the parking lot and the man in the photograph had the same eyes, the same angle of the jaw, the same way of being present in a moment as if they'd decided it mattered. Tommy handed it back carefully. He told Danny to keep it somewhere safe. The boy folded it with both hands and tucked it into the front pocket of his cargo shorts, over his heart, which was where he had been keeping it all along. 6 months later, Tommy made the drive to Amarillo for a toy run the chapter organized every December. Angela brought Danny, and the boy arrived wearing a small leather jacket the church had sourced and had fitted properly, with a single patch on the front that read, "Son of Rook." He wore it the way his father had worn his vest in the photograph, with the ease of someone who understood what it meant and had decided it was worth carrying. At the end of the run, when the bikes were lined up outside the donation center and the brothers were unloading boxes, Danny found Tommy near his bike and stood beside him for a moment without saying anything. Then he said that he'd been thinking about what Tommy had told him in the parking lot, about paying attention when something tells you to stop. He said he thought that was probably the most important thing a person could do. Tommy looked at this boy who was 7 years old and had crossed a gas station parking lot alone with a photograph and asked a stranger the bravest question he knew how to ask, and had waited with patience and steadiness for someone to finally give him the answer he needed. He told Danny that he thought he was right, that paying attention was the beginning of everything that mattered, that the people who changed things, who kept someone from being lost, who made sure a child knew he was seen and remembered and claimed, were almost always the ones who had learned to slow down in the middle of ordinary life and notice what was actually there. Danny nodded and looked out at the line of motorcycles catching the December light. He said that when he was old enough, he was going to ride too. Tommy said that sounded right. He said his father would have liked that very much.